Hey y'all. So I always kind of think about trying to write more again, but it's kind of seemed difficult. So I'm gonna fuck around with some visual and audio stuff a bit more. I'm gonna pick up the mic. It's gonna be interesting. Anyways, um, so it's Juneteenth day, and I mean I'm not going to any celebrations. And that's unfortunate. Still unsure about what's going on with my health. Haven't heard exactly back from my doc, but the tests kind of seem to be pointing in the direction of autoimmune disorders. So I'm, being very super precautious about, well, being around other people. But with that said, was having an interesting conversation with a friend down in Louisville, and about uh, Brianna there, and just kind of everything in general. I mean, he's a white guy, and it's that's interesting in of itself. But um, he was he mentioned that they're gonna burn the city down, right? And he wasn't saying that in a bad way. It's just like he grew up there, and he wasn't saying it was unjust or in a negative connotation. He's just kind of stating it as a matter of fact. When these officers that killed her aren't going to be charged. I mean, it's eventually going to happen. Otherwise, charges probably would have happened already. But I'm just saying, it's like for officers to be fired and charged, it's rare. What we've seen in Atlanta and Minneapolis is very, very rare. These things don't happen for a lot of different reasons. Legally, it's just very difficult due to Graham versus Connor. Um, but within that, some interesting thoughts I was thinking about, and really kind of it builds off effectively other people's. I mean, there's Baldwin, there's King, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in these thoughts about what these are and why they're labeled riots. And if people love to still say and use King's words, riots are the voices of is the voice of the unheard, and he goes into after that. Now, what haven't um, you heard? And he's really talking about kind of the social conditions that create riots and the cry for really freedom and the end of oppression and some absolutely brilliant words. And he's right. But at the same time, what's been going on and what's historically gone on is I don't know if you can actually call them really riots. Um, and within that, so yeah, I think that, well, really that. So I told my friends sometimes shit just burns. Sometimes shit's just gotta burn. And what I really meant by that was that sometimes as social conditions get to a point where it's something that just happens. As in so many ways, people feel they are left with no other options, no other recourse, but to just burn shit. It becomes a form of protest. And a lot of times it's not necessarily a senseless or random property destruction or violence. And let's be clear here, property destruction in of itself isn't necessarily violence. It is property destruction. Now, if you're destroying property, there are aspects of property destruction that could be considered violent in certain contexts. But in the context of these protests and many black uprisings, I do not say that. Now, if we want to talk about some of the race riots like Tulsa, the property destruction there was absolutely full of violence, and there's some very real violence on human beings where we know upwards of probably over 1,000 and sometimes it's 10,000 or so people died, killed. Mostly black people were killed by white mobs and police officers and the U.S. Army Air Corps. This is before the Air Force was formed. This is 1921. Dropped bombs on this black neighborhood. And so part of the property destruction there was violent. What's his name? General Sherman's march to Sherman, yeah, to the ocean, right? Sherman, like that was violent. Even outside of the killing, like the property destruction, the burning was part of the violence. So kind of the surrounding context, what goes on in the violence is it of the property destruction kind of can inform you whether that property destruction is violent or not. Now, in the light of these protests, I'd say they're not. Now, the police actions, I would say, very much are violent. I mean, police are inherently a violent institution, violent organization, and a profession, using state sanction and or violence to enforce quote unquote peace, right? The threat of violence, legally backed violence, to enforce laws and so-called peace. But these, I wouldn't call them the property destruction violence. But even more importantly than that, it's not senseless. And let be like, even though much of the national press has moved away, there's still police brutality going on in a lot of these protests. There's still some property destruction, and but again, it's not senseless or random as you might think. And a lot of these uprisings, and uprisings is the right word, or even really what you can call this moment is effectively a rebellion. Um, but it looks far more chaotic than it probably really is, particularly on the inside. I mean, there's definitely chaos to it, but a lot of that is due to police involvement, and police kicking that off. So what ends up happening with this is that the story becomes one of chaos and riots, opposed to that of rebellion, because that really, like the oppressive class, that like that's their narrative of what you could dub the oppressive class, that the neutral media, so-called neutral media, but that's like the what they all dub like kind of the neutral media take, in calling these uprisings, these rebellions, riots and violent. One, not properly pointing to the direction where most of the violence is coming from, and that is the police. And secondly, ascribing violence to property destruction. So effectively and riots makes these things feel more senseless. But there's really the semantics of it are important, and this was really my point. Is instead of calling them uprisings or even calling this a rebellion, and it is a rebellion, is that calling it a rebellion changes the narrative. A couple of two big examples of many historical examples. One is the Boston Tea Party, which is seen as a rebellion. That is the narrative, that has to be told, because if it's called a riot, it's different. And the Boston Tea Party is a core part of the mythology of the United States, and that it loves to tell itself of this rebellion against oppression. And so, like, again, this what you label something is important. And the other is how the FBI treated the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, particularly with COINTELPRO. J. Edgar Hoover, rightfully, in a lot of the stuff, you could, whether it's directly or indirectly, were calling this movement, the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, a rebellion towards the ruling order of the United States. His greatest fear was a black messiah, that would have been capable of uniting the underclasses. So black people in general, Latinos, Asian Americans, or immigrant populations in general, and low-income whites, into the cause. And that split, particularly from low-income whites, has been there for a long time, since the 1600s, the mid-late 1600s, blanking out an exact date, and I was just reading about this again the other day, about basically the creation of the slave codes in Virginia, which explicitly stated in law the separation between white indentured servants and black slaves. And slaves was basically interchangeable with less savory words, and or being black. Slavery and black were really interchangeable at that point in a lot of ways, or at least that was really the start and the rise of it being interchangeable. So what we end up going on within this is the FBI recognized these things what was going on is rebellion. That's why he's scared to death of King and Malcolm X and Fred Hampton, and had Fred Hampton assassinated by the Chicago Police Department. That and his that's a whole thing. If you don't know about the assassination of Fred Hampton, study up on that. That's a wild one. That's a whole nother story. But again, even though but when you think about how even historically you look back upon the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and the riots, and look at me even defaulting to call it riots, but the rebellions and uprisings in that the larger kind of rebellion within that movement itself are called riots, right? And there are more than that. And again, King even identified that in of himself. But again, what happens when that starts being called a rebellion? What questions start to pop up that are different? And so once you give what it's going on right now its proper name, get a rebellion, this changes everything. But this also gets to the core problem, not just white people or white liberals, but I still think effectively the majority of the American public is holding on to the belief that America is generally good, that even with all its flaws, that it has been a good force of nature. Because needing to label these riots and not condemn them equal to or more than the conditions that created them, which is done by many of different parts of the political spectrum. Like, this is not just a conservative problem or right-wing problem, to be more exact. Really upholds that belief. So as soon as you start labeling these things as rebellions, you have to ask yourself a different kind of question. What are they rebelling against and why? And these things kind of hit different when you think about it different, right? We're so caught up in that, even if we call it a rebellion, a lot of these folks will call it, like, so if we call this a rebellion, and a lot of folks that might even not be that upset with the property destruction, that will, Black Lives Matter, people even in the streets and so on and so forth, might not be willing to accept this idea that it is actually a rebellion. And you're gonna, people will refuse to adapt that, and then become radical, or they'll believe that it is radical. And so these are effectively, it's rebellion. So what are we rebelling against? And that is effectively the general, what has long been, and from inception, the order of the United States, of this country, which is a racially oppressive and economically oppressive and genderly oppressive, so on and so forth, order, which isn't necessarily unique to the United States, as many nations across the world have this in different ways. China right now as well. So, they got some concentration camps and doing some pretty ugly things right now themselves. But it is, there are definitely aspects of it unique to the United States, and we have to understand those aspects. Just as if you're looking at protests in Hong Kong and understand that is a rebellion, but you cannot look at these protests and understand these are a rebellion against the order of the United States, and its oppressive nature, and its oppressive history and practices and institutions, so on and so forth, then you're thinking about this wrong. Now, whether this rebellion succeed or not, who knows? Most rebellions don't succeed. They don't. And even, the Boston Tea Party and the Revolution weren't the first rebellions in the American colonies, either. A lot of, there were other rebellions that failed, some more egalitarian than others, like Bacon's Rebellion, which was the launching point for the Black Codes in Virginia, because it was unifying white indentured servants and enslaved blacks at that time, Black Americans at that time. And kind of the white ruling class realized that they needed to further separate out those two entities from rising up against each other. So then that's when they started basically deputizing any really any white people, particularly lower class white people, to become the overseers of enslaved Africans and black people within America. That wasn't, the complete start of that, but that was one of the key moments of the creation of what we might dub white privilege. Uh, so on this day, on Juneteenth, think about this moment as a rebellion, and think about what that means, and particularly in the context of the United States. And if it's uncomfortable to you to think about the United States as an oppressive nation, and a nation that is not generally good, challenge yourself to that. I find it difficult to take an honest look at American history and feel that somehow the scales are weighted towards that of generally good. And yes, there's other nations that have done some horrible things too during the same time period. But that doesn't matter. Think about it this way. You can't kill your entire family or abuse your entire family. Then point to your... Yeah, you can't... Yeah, sorry, a little call interrupted this recording, but you can't... Yeah, you can't abuse your family and point to your neighbor that also does the same thing and say they do it too, and somehow that excuses my behavior. And this is perhaps maybe, one of the core, the many core hypocrisies of conservatives and the idea of what a individual responsibility, right? The inability to take responsibility for this country's actions and its oppressive nature, particularly by pointing out that other countries have done oppressive shit too, and that at times we've been in conflict with those nations. Like, those things aren't mutually exclusive. These things can be, multiple things can be true at the same time. The United States can be an oppressive nation, just as much as Stalin was a brutal dictator. These and the United States could have been at odds, was at odds with the Soviet Union. These things aren't mutually exclusive at all. We just have to believe that we are on the side of good as it ends up justifying or helping to justify a lot of the damage this nation has caused, and violence this nation has caused throughout the world. And that is something that I believe I will talk about at a later date. Happy Juneteenth.